As we move into the tail end of 2023, Intel are launching their 14th generation of Gen Core processors, Raptor Lake refresh. And while it's new, as the name suggests, it is only a refresh of what we saw in the 13th generation Raptor Lake processors. So while we should see an uplift in performance, in all honesty, it's not going to be anything mind-blowing. And due to how close I think the performance will actually be, we're bundling all three processors into one piece of content, with the i5 14600K, i7 14700K, and the flagship, at least for now, i9 14900K. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So refreshes are nothing new. We've seen it before from both AMD and Intel, with new generations from Team Blue or XT branded products from Team Red that give them a chance to refine their process a bit, squeeze a bit more power out of it, and in some cases actually increase the core count ever so slightly. Firstly, the i5 14600K, which is arguably the CPU out of the three that has seen the least amount of work done to it, with no core changes, no extra cache, and the only real change coming in terms of speeds. The E-Core max turbo frequency has been increased from 3.9 GHz on the 13th gen to 4 GHz on the newer 14th gen, while the P-Core max turbo frequency has increased from 5.1 GHz to 5.3. So we should see a small uplift in performance for applications that can harness a longer sustained period of boost, maybe even in gaming, which we have actually tested the chip in 15 games, so that's going to be an interesting one to see. Moving up the stack to the i7 14700K, this CPU has actually seen an increase in the core count, ever so slightly, from the same 8 performance cores that its predecessor had, but now sees 12 efficiency cores up from 8 on the i7 13700K. Along with this and the fact that it has more cores means that it also comes with more cache, now at 33 MB up from 30 MB on the 13th gen counterpart. We also get a slight boost in speeds again, with the Turbo Max 3.0 frequency now hitting 5.6 GHz, which is a 200 MHz increase over the 13th gen equivalent at 5.4 GHz, along with the P-Core Max Turbo frequency increasing from 5.3 to 5.5, and the E-Core Max Turbo frequency seeing a smaller 100 MHz boost up to 4.3. So I guess in theory, I'd like to think we'll see a bigger uplift, though again, it's more likely in multi-threaded tasks rather than single-threaded applications. And then lastly, moving up to the flagship i9 14900K. This, much like the i5, has seen no physical changes in core or thread counts, along with sporting the same 36MB Intel Smart Cache, but again, has had some tweaks to its speeds, and if anything, can be seen as more of a, let's say, marketing effort than anything, now hitting an Intel thermal velocity boost frequency of 6 GHz, which is 200 MHz over its older brother. And in all honesty, 6 GHz is just a better buzzword number compared to 5.8. Hence why I think it's more of a marketing move than anything that will provide significant amounts of extra performance. Along with this, the Turbo Boost Max 3.0 frequency has seen a 100 MHz increase up to 5.8 GHz. The P-Core Max Turbo frequency is now 200 MHz faster at 5.6, and the E-Core Boost is 100 MHz faster, now at 4.3. But unlike the other CPUs, the base frequencies on both the P-Cores and the E-Cores have both seen a 200 MHz increase, now at 3 GHz and 2.2 GHz respectively. So there's small changes here and there, and to get a general idea as to how these new speeds react to application usage, we booted up Cinebench R23 to find out. On the i5 14600K during a Cinebench multi-core run, we found all of the P-cores sitting at a comfortable 5.3 GHz, while the E-cores stayed at their maxed out 4 GHz boost clock. During a single core run, the clock speed behaviour was exactly the same, with the P-cores maxing out at 5.3 GHz and the same 4 GHz for the efficiency cores. So at least we're getting the full potential out of the i5 in both types of workload. Moving up to the i7 14700K and putting that through the same multi-core run, and we do see that new 5.6 GHz boost speed for a split second on P-Core 4 and 5. Though for the most part, the cores are running at around 5.3 to 5.4 GHz on the P-cores, while the E-cores sit back at their max rated speed of 4.3. When we run the single core test, we do find again P-Core 4 and 5 boosting up to 5.6 GHz for a slightly longer period, showing us that they are the strongest cores out of the 8, while all other performance cores remained at a steady 5.5 GHz. Then lastly, with the i9 14900K and looking at clock speed behaviour, in multi-core Cinebench we see P-Cores 6 and 7 hitting 6 GHz for a very brief period, while all other P-Cores managed a max of 5.7 GHz, and hold that pretty steady through some of the test. The efficiency cores mostly stuck around 4.2 to 4.3 GHz, with all cores occasionally peaking at 4.4. As we move over to single core, P-Core 6 and 7 again hit 6 GHz for a moment and then dropped to 5.7 along with all other performance cores, while the E-Cores all boosted to their max rated 4.4 GHz boost speed for the entire test. So getting on to the good stuff, testing. And for this, we've spent the last week of around 16-hour days retesting every CPU we had from the last couple of generations from both AMD and Intel. So all of the data that you see here today is completely new and fresh. Now for our testing, we used our brand new Intel test bench consisting of an Asus ROG Maximus Z790 Extreme motherboard with 32GB of Team Group T-Force Delta RGB 7600MHz CL36 memory. For our graphics card, and to alleviate any bottleneck, we use the Inno3D RTX 4090 with the 537.42 driver, and all of our testing was done on the latest version of Windows 11. And as this is a CPU review, our gaming benchmarks will only be focusing on 1080p, where we can put the processors under the most strain. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting with 3D Mark FireStrike, and things are off to a good start for the i7, which replaces its predecessor as the fastest CPU tested, with a good balance between speed and cores, while the i5 does see an uplift of around 6%, which now puts it above the 5800X 3D, 5950X and 7600X, while the i9 14900K does see a performance jump, but only of 1%, which is enough to beat the 5900X, but does nothing else of significance. In Timespy, the newer 14th Gen i9 sees no extra performance and is somewhat throttled at the high end, while the i7 sees a small performance uplift, but only of 2%, so again nothing of significance, while the i5 sees even less extra performance going from gen to gen, which if this is what we're expecting to see in the other tests, this is going to be a bit of a boring one, I'm afraid. In Geekbench, the i5 sees a bigger uplift than our previous tests when looking at the multi-core score of a little over 6%, while single core comes in a little less at just 4%. Which is nice to see, but is unlikely to lend much extra performance in real-world tests. The i7, however, sees our biggest gain yet of 15% in the multi-core test, while single-core comes in less at just 6%, which puts it just above the 7950X, though still lags behind in the multi-core performance. Then the i9, which topped our chart anyway, sees the most insignificant gain in multi-core performance of just 1 point. While in single-core performance there is an increase of 3%, which widens the gap with AMD as the best performing CPU. In PCMark 10 Express, AMD still lead the way with the new i9 14900K thrown into the mix with 3% faster performance compared to the 13900K, while the i7 sees a smaller 2% increase in performance and the lower end i5 giving us our greatest uplift of 5% gen on gen. Google Octane is a web browser based test which again shows a small uplift in performance on the i5, which leapfrogs the 7600X and 7950X from AMD, as well as the 12900K and 13700K from previous generations, while the i7 sees a larger increase in performance of 5%, pitching itself just above its i5 counterpart, which also sits just below the i9 parts, where the 14900K has an increase in performance of 4% over the 13900K. Mozilla Kraken is very much the same story with some small increases in performance which lead to faster times to complete. The i5 shaves its time down by 8%, putting it closer to the i7 from last generation, while the i7 sees a small reduction in time of 4%, which puts it just ahead of the 13900K, which, moving up to the 14th gen, now takes top spot on our chart with a 4% reduction in completion time. In our last web browser test, WebXPRT, improvements are there of around 6% when looking at the uplift from the 13600K, but more importantly this further extends the lead over AMD's top tier CPUs, while both the i7 and i9 see smaller improvements of around 2%, which just further widens their lead over Team Red. In SuperPi, the i5 14600K sees a small reduction of 4% in calculation time gen to gen, along with the i7 14700K coming in with the same marginal difference, while the i9 doesn't hold up anywhere near as well, with just a 1% reduction in calculation time, though that does still mean that Intel hold the top spot by quite some margin when compared to AMD. In our first rendering benchmark, the i5 14600K comes in 15% faster than its predecessor, while the 14700K commands a still somewhat impressive 12% lead over the 13700K, and again leapfrogs AMD's 7900X. Sadly, the flagship i9 doesn't see as much of a performance increase at just 4%, and still gets beaten by both the Ryzen 9 7950X and 7950X3D by over 9%. Corona sees some strong reductions in render time, with the i5 shaving off 9% of its render time gen to gen, the i7 seeing a much healthier 14% decrease, and the i9 coming in 5% faster, which now matches the performance of the 7950X at just 36 seconds. In Keyshot Viewer, the gains are even more impressive, with the i5 and i7 now coming in 18% faster, which puts the i5 ahead of the Ryzen 5000 series, while the i7 again pushes ahead of the Ryzen 9 7900X, which is pretty impressive to see, though the i9 somewhat falls flat on its face with less than a 1% gain in performance, which still sees Intel sitting 2% lower than AMD's 7950X. In V-Ray, there are strong performance increases again of 7% on the i5 and 16% on the i7, though again the i9 is the odd one out with just a 3% performance uplift compared to its predecessor, which still isn't enough to reach the performance levels of the Ryzen 9 7950 and 7950X3D. PugetBench was a bit of an odd one, as all three CPUs saw performance drops in the extended test, which could be down to a variety of factors, including thermals, silicon lottery, or PugetBench along with Davinci just not geared for these new processors fully. Either way, for those looking to use their system for video rendering, well, it's not looking great if you're choosing one of these CPUs. In Cinebench R23, the improvements really show in the multi-core score, with a gen-to-gen increase of 8% on the i5, while single-core comes in slightly less at 4%, though it does push the i5 up the stack slightly, now performing better than the i7 12700K. Speaking of i7s, the 14700K comes in a much healthier 17% faster than the 13700K, which, while it doesn't do much in terms of the order of our chart, it's still a nice increase to see. Though the same can't be said for the single-core test, which only sees a less than 2% uplift gen to gen. Lastly, the i9, which was already leading our charts by less than 1% over the Ryzen 9 7950X, has now seen a 3% increase, which now pushes that gap over AMD to a little over 4%. Lastly, in terms of memory bandwidth, again, it's just a refresh, so across Ada 64 and looking at general throughput, there's nothing really to talk about, with margin of error increases, and some results where we actually saw the newer generation come in slightly lower in terms of sheer bandwidth, though still puts Intel far ahead of even the best AMD processors, which in some cases struggle to even utilise the same speed memory. When it comes to latency, things take a slight turn, with all 14th gen CPUs coming in with higher latency, potentially due to extra strain being put onto the IMC now that we have faster cores, or more of them in some cases, though it's nothing really to cause any concern. So moving over to gaming and starting things off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which shows that anything 13th gen and above doesn't really see much change in terms of performance, and in case of the 14th gen, actually sees both the i5 and the i7 performing worse than their 13th generation counterparts, and the i9 coming in with identical performance to its older brother, though with a very small uplift in the 1% lows. In Cyberpunk 2077, the i5 sees a margin of error increase in performance in the averages, but does see a strong 15% increase in performance in the 1% lows, lending itself to a more stable and more fluid gameplay experience. While the i7 sees an increase in performance of 6%, which now puts it ahead of both the Gaming King 7800X3D and i9 13900K, which has also seen a 5% increase in performance and takes our top spot as the best CPU for this game in the form of the 14900K. Enabling ray tracing just to give another metric and likely how you'd play the game, and the i5 actually loses performance, albeit by just a single frame, while the i7 sees a small, but could be argued, margin of error gain of just 2%, which puts it top of our chart and matching the 14900K, though again has more solid 1% low figures with a 5% improvement over its predecessor. Talking to the i9, there isn't really much going on with just a single frame improvement, and retesting could see that gap enlarge or shrink ever so slightly. In F123, the i5 14600K saw a 5% decrease in performance from the 13th gen, while the i7 saw a 1% improvement, though at 400 plus frames per second, it's nothing that you'd ever notice anyway, and is the same for the i9 with a 2% lead over the 13900K, which puts it at the top of the Intel results, though still falls behind AMD's X3D CPUs. The i5 displays similar findings in FarCry 6 with marginal differences of 1% when upgrading to the 14th gen, and it's a similar affair with both the i7 and the i9 processors at less than 1%, now at 234 and 241 FPS respectively. So some good numbers and ahead of AMD, but nothing noteworthy if looking to upgrade from the 13th generation. Hogwarts Legacy doesn't really give much of a talking point for the i5 with less than a 1% performance gain over the 13600K, while the i7 takes a bit of a nosedive with 4% less performance over the 13700K. And retesting both CPUs garnered the same results every single time. The only chip that did see an uplift worth discussing is the i9, which at 177 FPS was already very strong in terms of performance, but with 3% more performance and stronger 1% lows, it's a modest uplift, but not something I'd spend my money on if I was already rocking a 13900K. Horizon Zero Dawn is a pretty intensive game, and the 14600K does make a difference here with 7% more performance over its 13th gen counterpart, and with stronger lows as well. The 14700K doesn't do as well with just a 2% increase in performance, and while the i9 does come in slightly stronger, it's still only a small 3% margin, and nothing that would set the world alight, especially as AMD rule in this game with their 3D Vcache parts. Finally, we start to see some bigger improvements going gen to gen in Spider-Man on very high, where the 14600K now commands 19% more performance over the 13600K, which moves it up our chart quite significantly. Whereas the 14700K comes in equally impressive, now being 11% faster in both the averages and 1% lows, which also means that Intel now push past the 7950X3D and come in nigh on identically with the 7800X3D, and bringing the fight to Team Red. This fight heats up even more when looking at the i9, as even though the increase in performance is small at just 3%, it's enough to top our chart and push ahead of the 7800X3D, which did previously hold the top spot. Enabling ray tracing because this game looks frankly awesome with it enabled, and the i5 14600K comes in 6% faster than the gen before, now matching the performance of the 7900X, though with arguably better 1% lows. The i7 sees a similar 5% uplift in performance, though it doesn't do anything in terms of the standings, while the i9 manages another 4% more performance, which puts it just behind the X3D chips from AMD. In Microsoft Flight Sim, AMD's 3D parts dominate due to their 3D Vcache technology, though the i7 still saw a 6% increase in performance over the previous generation, which now puts it above the i9 13900K, while the 14900K sees a smaller 5% uplift in frame rates, though the i5 actually sees a margin of error single FPS difference between the i5, though the 14th gen does display slightly better 1% lows, so I guess you could chalk that up as a little bit of a win. In Ratchet and Clank on the very high setting, there isn't really much to say, with the i5 coming in 3% faster than the gen before, which now puts it above the 5800X3D, while the i7 14700K becomes mathematically pointless as it matches the performance of the 13700K, and actually does a margin of error worse in the 1% lows. The i9 sees an uplift of 1%, which now puts it just behind the 7800X3D, though with such close results, you'd be happy with any of the CPUs tested to play this game. Enabling ray tracing sees the performance drop as expected across the board, and a lot of the results shift around a bit, now with 3% less performance when comparing the i5 14600K to the i5 13600K, which again, retesting showed exactly the same results. Now it's not all bad news, as the i7 14700K comes in with 9% more performance than its Raptor Lake counterpart, while the i9 comes in with an increase, but only of a little over 4% overall. In Remnant II, without sounding like I'm repeating myself, performance is again pretty much identical between both the i5 processors, and when comparing the two i7 processors, with only the i9 giving us something noteworthy to talk about, because even though the uplift is only a little under 2% gen to gen, it now puts it level with the 7950X3D, which was topping our charts, though Intel fight a bit more with 13% better 1% low figures, becoming the top CPU to use to play this game. In the Riftbreaker, again the i5 loses some performance by around 2%, whereas the i7 saw less than a 1% improvement on the 14700K in both the averages and 1% lows, and now sits just 6 FPS behind AMD's flagship gaming CPU, the 7950X3D. The good news for Intel is that the 6% extra performance that the tweaks gave over the 13700K now means that it's the king of this title, and comes out 3% faster than the 7950X3D, which was leading the pack. Then, finally, in Watch Dogs Legion, the i5 suddenly wakes up and offers up 6% more frames over the Raptor Lake i5, now at 164 FPS, while the i7 comes in less than 1% faster than its predecessor, the 13700K, which doesn't really affect its standings in our charts either, with AMD leading the pack with both the 7800X3D and 7950X3D, followed closely behind by the i9 14900K, which again only manages an extra 2% performance over the 13900K. Okay, so I have to admit, that was pretty painful to go through, because in some instances, it almost seemed like the 14th gen was a bit of a redundant range of products. Though luckily, there were a few instances where the 14th gen did maybe make a little bit more sense. Like the i7 14700K coming in 11% faster and matching the 7800X3D gaming beast, or in some of the productivity-based tests where AMD were just ahead, and with the extra speed now on the 14th gen, it allowed Intel to surpass them. Though in those instances, it was by only a very, very small margin. And I'd consider it more, I don't know, bragging rights as such, instead of ahead by a huge amount. Though that's no real issue, because being top is being top, and looks great on headlines. Now when it comes to gaming, because I guess that's where the majority of our audience is looking, things are quite interesting. AMD has X3D and Intel just has raw power, and depending on the title, that can go in favour of one or the other. Now to get a clearer picture of the standings, if we look at the averages of all 15 games, we do see that the i5 14600K only sees an uplift overall of less than 2% from the 13th gen to the 14th gen. And while that does now mean the i5 is the better CPU for gaming over the Ryzen 9 7950X, it's only by a margin of error, and is likely comparing apples to oranges, especially if you're doing more than just gaming. Now moving up to the i7, and the gain is very similar, of around 2% when looking at the uplift from the 13700K. So again, nothing to make you go wow, or to upgrade if you're already utilising 13th gen. And then on the i9 we see a similar 2% gain, though this does now put the 14900K above the 7800X3D for gaming, and puts it level pegging with the 7950X3D, though the Intel CPU comes in with better 1% lows. So it's good and bad for Intel. Good in the sense that they are arguably the gaming king, but bad in terms of kind of that's all we get for the next generation. And this is likely down to the reason as to why Intel haven't exactly been overly vocal with this launch, and why they haven't, should we say, hyped it up massively. So what does this all mean in terms of value for money? Well, what this means for cost per frame is that the i5 has seen an increase in the cost per frame by 9%. The i7 has actually seen a decrease by 2%, and the i9 has seen an increase of just 1%. And that honestly has made me stop and wonder. If I break it down, the i5 doesn't seem worth it. The i7 is a no-brainer if you're not already on the 13th gen and rocking a 13700K, and the i9 seems worth it if you're toying between the two. I mean, generally speaking, you will pay an early adopter tax for any new hardware, and while we don't see huge uplifts in performance for the 14th gen, if you can get the very latest for around the same price, well, you'd be stupid not to go for it. So, performance aside, how much heat and how much power is generated by these new chips, because that's always been a bit of a stumbling block. We all know that Intel typically run warm, and that was pretty evident when we ran Cinebench, though under gaming, it's a slightly different story. The i5 14600K managed to come in a staggering 17% cooler throughout the averages of 12 games, which equates to 14 degrees. While you could argue this is due to the tweaks in the boost speed, there's likely more going on than just kind of terms of no two CPUs being the same, and of course then you have the likes of the Silicon Lottery, and that's clear to see with the i7, which sees an uplift of 5% in terms of temperature from the 13700K, equating to 4 degrees on average. Though the big one that everyone gets hung up on is the i9, where things are looking up, as it actually shaves off 6 degrees, meaning that the 14900K is now 6% cooler than its predecessor. Again, not being oblivious to the fact manufacturing is playing a bigger part here than the, let's say, magic that Intel have done on this generation, because underneath, apart from the i7, it's basically the same. Now, there's also good news for the i9 in terms of power draw, where again, over 12 games, it did see a reduction, though only by 2%. So to see any benefit in terms of the cost of running it, you'd actually be paying a little more for every about 200 hours of gaming, so nothing to really cause any concern. The i7 has seen a jump in power usage of 13%, though that was actually expected due to the extra cores and cache, while the i5 actually saw a decrease in power usage by 13%, which is making me think, I don't know, maybe we have a pretty decent i5 14600K here that can run with less power and quite dramatically cooler too. It's just a shame that it doesn't offer much more performance overall. So, how do I sum this one up? It's not good, but it's not bad. It's just, I don't know, somewhere in between. And that's probably the fairest way to put it across. Whether you're looking at the i5, the i7 or the i9, you're going to be pleased no matter what. and I honestly believe Intel were treating the 14th gen as a headline grabbing exercise. As I said earlier, they haven't shouted from the rooftops about this launch, as well there isn't really anything to shout about. Though in terms of gaming, you could argue they are king, even though they match with AMD's 7950X3D, because the 1% lows are slightly better. And I guess the overall cost per frame is lower on the 14900K. So yeah, maybe AMD need to sit with that being the fact, or maybe they need to do some sizable price cuts to bring things a little more in line. So I guess, yeah, the big question, should you buy a 14th generation CPU no matter what model you're looking at? Well, I'd say that if you're already on 13th gen or on AMD's latest platform, maybe with an X3D processor, then no, there really isn't enough to warrant the change, unless you're able to sell your current hardware for a good price and get a pretty special cost to change. But that's probably not going to happen. Now that aside, of course, buying the latest of anything will set you back a premium. But compared to Ryzen's 5000 series or Intel's 12th gen or below, you're going to see a large increase in performance. But unless you are, I guess, on 12th gen Intel, then you are going to have to buy new memory and a new motherboard, depending on the chipset. And then you're stepping into a territory that just keeps adding on the dollars at every single turn. And that about wraps this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and thanks for sticking kind of with me through those frankly laborious benchmarks. It's always easier to get excited when the margin or uplift between two processors is a lot larger, but sadly that just wasn't the case today. Now if you like this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing, and if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you get access to exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, a super special area over on our Discord, and much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.